Joe Biden has said he's going to announce his vice presidential pick around August 1st. And until then, the debate continues around who is on the list and let alone who's going to be the final choice.
Sabato's Crystal Ball's managing editor Kyle Kondik compiled a list of the top choices and what the Biden campaign's rationale could be for each different woman. And Kyle joins us now to expand on the former vice president's possible choice for his running mate. Great to see you, Kyle.
Good to see you, Kyle.
Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm.
So how have these protests changed the calculus for Joe Biden in his selection?
I do think the impetus for selecting an African-American running mate has probably gone up. And in fact, one of the names we didn't have on our list that actually I think we almost certainly will the next time we do it is Keisha Lance Bottoms, the mayor of Atlanta, who I think has become a really prominent figure now. You know, she doesn't have the top level experience that VP choices almost always have. You know, they're almost always a member of Congress or a governor. But she's someone whose star has risen. But, you know, you think about Kamala Harris, I think she probably is the leading candidate on almost every kind of pundit list. And I think there are good reasons to think that she's a top contender. Val Demings, African-American congresswoman, former police chief from Orlando, is also high on our list and many others. So I think that might be, you know, one of the dynamics. But we also have to remember that what's dominating the news today may not necessarily be dominating the news on or about August 1st, which is when Biden has suggested he'll make his pick.
Yeah, and that's something we want to focus in here, Kyle, which is traditionally, what can you lose from a vice presidential pick and what can you gain? Is it just punditocracy? Is it media? In the past, based on the polls, how should candidates think about vice presidential picks?
Look, I think ideally you pick someone who is you know, fulfills the old Hippocratic oath first and foremost, which is, you know, first do no harm. And there have been some vice presidential picks over the years that I think probably have maybe caused some damage to the ticket. I think say most recently probably Sarah Palin in 2008, although John McCain probably wasn't going to win that election anyway. But also I think that Palin was sort of a pick of a candidate who felt a little bit desperate, as John McCain should have felt in 2008. It was just a really bad year to be the Republican presidential nominee. You know, you think about someone like Tim Kaine from 2016. I don't know if he really hurt or helped. I kind of think Mike Pence maybe helped a little bit in terms of consolidating support from white evangelical Christians, which is sort of the bedrock demographic of the Republican Party. I guess if I were Biden, I guess I would be cautious, but I'm also not in politics, so I don't, you know, he's going to have to come up with his own rationale. But I would first of all think about someone who's just not going to hurt, particularly because it does seem like Biden is leading this race right now. That's not guaranteed to continue, but that might also push Biden toward a more kind of conservative pick, not politically, not in terms of ideology, but in terms of whether it's sort of a safe pick or not. But, you know, sometimes that's not the right decision.
Yeah,
makes sense.
Someone who's sort of safe and test. I mean, that was the thinking behind Tim Kaine, frankly, was that he was just sort of like standard, safe, inoffensive, and that Hillary was leading in the polls. I do think that the dynamics are this different this time around. Biden seems to be up more significantly over Trump than Hillary was at this time. Of course, as you point out, that can change. Amy Klobuchar seemed like she was really a leading contender. Now it seems like she's sort of totally off the list because of her record, prosecutorial record in Minnesota in particular, failing to prosecute Officer Chauvin, who ends up murdering George Floyd. First of all, do you think that is true, that she is totally off the list? And second of all, does Kamala Harris have any issues in her record in the same vein? She did come under a lot of heat during the Democratic primary for her own record prosecutorially.
I think one key difference between Klobuchar and Harris, at least in terms of their backgrounds in and around law enforcement, is that I think that there were a lot of African-American leaders in particular who already were really skeptical of Klobuchar and her background even before the George Floyd incident. There was a big takeout in one of the big national papers, I think published like 2 days before George Floyd was murdered. And so there was already a pre-existing problem again, with some black leaders in a way that I don't necessarily think there was with Harris. And so that's a factor. I do think Klobuchar is probably not a leading contender at this point, and I would have thought she was a leading contender if we had maybe talked before Memorial Day. You know, so that's, you know, Klobuchar, again, you know, I think she's probably not really all that much in consideration now. Although, you know, again, these things can change. But keep in mind, you know, imagine a world in which Biden had announced his pick early on, and that pick had been Klobuchar. What if he'd even promised the vice presidency to Klobuchar in return for an endorsement back in March? That would have, I think, been a real big mistake. And so that's,
right.
I think, shows sort of some of the impetus to wait as Biden is doing, and as really as every presidential nominee has done, is to wait to announce the VP pick.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Kyle, we also want to get your reaction. There's a big kerfuffle around, the unskew the polls movement seems to be back. President Trump tweeting a memo from his pollster, John McLaughlin, saying that the polls were skewed against President Trump, a CNN poll showing him down 14 points in particular. Just what's your reaction to that as somebody who works in the industry?
Well, McLaughlin's probably most famous poll that became public was one showing Eric Cantor up a huge amount over Dave Bratt in the 2014 Republican primary. And of course, that was one of the great, primary losses of all time, really, in that Dave Bratt not just beat Eric Cantor, but beat him pretty convincingly in that 2014 Virginia 7th Congressional District primary. And so McLaughlin has a reputation as being a pollster who produces pretty favorable numbers for his own incumbents, and so I think a lot of us in the analysis industry don't really take his analysis on this to be very seriously. Now, I think it's perfectly possible that the national polls may be sort of overstating the size of Biden's lead at this point. I don't think Biden is going to win by 14 points or something like that, but I do think there's good reason to believe that Biden is up nationally and not just by a few points.
Yeah, lay that on.
That's the key part.
Lay that on a little bit more specifically, because we talked about the fact, look, these polls are still registered voters, which tends to benefit Democrats, and you did have, and if you're talking nationally, the Electoral College is also, likely to benefit President Trump. And then there were a few swing states last time around where the polling was significantly off. So given all of that, how do you kind of read the state of the race right now?
Well, look, I think that there has been Biden has led pretty consistently ever since 2019 in polls that have just asked, if you support Biden or Trump. Now, it got to a point in February where Biden was only up maybe 3 or 4 points in polling averages, which is sort of the range where the president's assets in the Electoral College and sort of the demographic realities in states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin that are maybe a little bit more friendly to Trump than the nation is as a whole. Biden's only up 3 or 4 points. That's when those sorts of distinctions start to matter. But if Biden's up more like 6 or 7 or 8, which is kind of more where these averages are now, that's a really substantial national lead. And at that point, the president's advantages in the Electoral College maybe don't matter quite as much. So that's the thing to watch. If we're sitting here around Labor Day and this thing is tightened back up to 3 or 4 or even 5 points, that's when I think if you start to maybe look at the race more as like a clear toss-up. Whereas today, I don't know if it is a clear toss-up. I think I definitely would rather be in Biden's shoes than Trump's as we're speaking today.
Yeah, I think that's a very smart way to look at it. Thank you, Kyle. We appreciate it.
Great to see you, Kyle.
Thank you.
Next on Rising, President Trump desperately wants former President George W. Bush to endorse Biden, and some Democrats do too. We're going to explain more when Rising continues.